You wait decades for a new biography of King John, one of the most disastrous monarchs in English history, and then two come along at once. The reason, of course, this year marks the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, one of the foundation documents of England's constitution, which John was forced by his rebellious barons to agree the year before he died. Both books are titled King John, and each is by a distinguished medieval historian, Dr. Marc and Professor Stephen Church. Marc, I think we can agree that King John was one of the most disastrous kings in English history, possibly the most. Why? In brief summary, why was his reign so terrible, dreadful?
It's probably easier to say what went right for John than what went wrong. I mean, what went wrong is such a long list. He starts his reign in 1199 as the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. He has this dominion that stretches from the English border with Scotland all the way down to the Pyrenees. He's the ruler of all of Western France. And very quickly into his reign, 4 or 5 years in, he loses all that continental inheritance, which is enormously shameful to him. And he spends the rest of his reign trying to fight to get it back, which means he has to raise huge amounts of money in England. So we get extortionate, oppressive taxation and money raising in England. And he does take an army back to the continent in 1214, but then again, militarily, it all goes wrong for him. He loses the military engagements he's involved in, which results in Magna Carta. When he comes home, the lid comes off the pot in terms of protest at his reign. John's got no interest in sticking to Magna Carta, so he repudiates it, which causes a civil war and a foreign invasion. And he ends his reign and he ends his life almost losing all of England. Had he lived a little longer, he probably would have lost England. So he goes from everything to nothing in the space of 16 years.
Stephen Church, how much of that was down to bad luck, and how much of that down to bad management?
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, how many of us are actually in charge of our own destinies? Even kings aren't in charge of their own destinies. John is facing the King of the French, a man called Philip Augustus, who is widely regarded as the recreator of the French kingdom. And he is also facing the most charismatic Pope of the Middle Ages, a man called Innocent III. So there are two characters there who he has to confront during the course of his reign, which make things very difficult for him.
But he does seem to have made his own situation worse by being diplomatically inept and also alienating all sorts of people who he really shouldn't have alienated, powerful barons. I mean, a man called Hugh de Lusignan, he nicked Hugh de Lusignan's fiancée, an 11-year-old, and married her himself with no kind of recompense. And the consequences of that were disastrous.
They were, in the end, disastrous. But actually, at the time, it looked like a good diplomatic move. For me, the most important thing that we can do as historians is to take the past on its own terms, try to unfold the past as it unfolded when it was the present, so that we can understand the decisions that John made. Yes, in retrospect, it proves to be a bad decision, but you know, there are modern examples which we can use. You know, invasion of Iraq, for example, modern examples that we can use which turn out to be bad decisions.
Marc, one of the things that his contemporaries noted about him was that he was quite simply cruel, which is going some, because medieval monarchs were often pretty harsh, but he really does seem to have taken it to considerably greater extents than other people. He murdered his nephew Arthur, and there was the horrible story of William de Briouse's wife and son.
In the period when John reigns, he's right in the middle of a period of chivalrous behaviour, and from the Norman conquest in England until the end of the 13th century, nobles, knights, anyone of status is not executed. They often throw themselves into battle, but they don't expect to die because they're well armed, they're wearing armour, and they expect to be captured and ransomed and treated with respect. So it's kind of like, you know, there is this non-violence in politics, if you like. They're trying to limit it. John breaks that taboo. John, as you say, not only does in Arthur, from the very start of his reign, he's starving people to death.
Matilda de Briouze and her son William, who's actually grown up, he was a man of sort of 40, they were starved to death either in Corfe Castle or in Windsor Castle. The sources vary. And that's a problem, isn't it? Because this is a dramatic story. Poor old Matilda is said to have outlived her son by a few days and to have gnawed his cheeks in a desperate attempt to find something to eat before she died. That's shocking, clearly shocked contemporaries. But because that story exists in several different forms, can we trust it, Steve?
Can we trust it? I think the events happened, yes. We can accept that the basic story is true, that William de Breosa, Matilda de St Valery, their son William, were in fact hounded to death.
I mean, if I could just come in there, is precisely the fact that we've got all these different sources. I mean, they might differ in their detail. You know, that story you mentioned, the horror story, as reported in by a French writer, of the gnawing of the cheeks, that's clearly designed to evoke, you know, pity.
Yes.
But it's reported in almost every chronicle, the starvation of this woman and her son. So there's no doubt it happened, and you know, they're disappeared. You know, and it's one of the things that directly feeds into Magna Carta. I think when the famous clause that talks about we won't go against anybody, we won't exile them, and we won't destroy them. You know, we won't bring about their ruin. That's precisely what John did to the Brioche family.
And would we still be talking about John if it had not been for Magna Carta? A disastrous king in many ways. If it weren't for Magna Carta, would we still remember him? I mean, medieval historians like you clearly would, but would he resonate with the rest of us?
Probably not. Henry III doesn't.
Yeah, but Henry III never chopped, you know, never executed people who starved them to death, had his kingdom invaded by the French. I mean, John is an absolute terrible personality, and I think they're always attractive.
You've written a biography of Edward I, and Edward I wasn't exactly kind and cuddly, was he?
Yeah, but he didn't starve people to death,
well,
Stephen.
What did he do to Simon de Montfort?
Yeah, he did it cleverly. That's the difference. You can be it's a successful tyrant versus a disastrous failure of a tyrant.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt at all. John was a failure as a king. From my perspective, I think the interesting thing is to try to understand why he was a failure.
Because he was a failure as a person.
Well, I don't think that that's true, actually. I mean, we started at the very beginning with asking me the question about whether there are any sort of wider forces that were going on that could explain why John is in the difficulty that he is. And there is a wider force going on, actually. It's the idea of conciliar government, taking counsel. And of course, what John does is he pretends to take counsel, and if he can't get his way from wider counsel, he'll take counsel from a particular small group of his followers. But he is running into a juggernaut, and the juggernaut is that the stakeholders in the kingdom are saying, actually, you know, you've got to rule with our counsel. You can't just rule as an absolute monarch.
Stephen Church, Marc Morris, thank you both very much indeed.